taught this kind of stuff for 50. I've taught this kind of stuff for 50 years, and including 4 times for OLLI. If you really want to dig into this, this is not required, but these are 2 books. I think one person has already bought them that are available. The first one is 55 or so dollars, and the second one is 115 or something, available from Springer. And this will back up and go into much more detail than I'm going to do here. And in addition, I'm basically an academic, and I can provide all kinds of stuff for you if you write me with specific questions. Okay, the objectives of this course are as follows. The first is a kind of art appreciation concept. But I took in college art appreciation, and it made a huge difference for me because I could look at art in a new way that was very important to me and understand it within the social context to some degree and so forth. And I wish to do that a little bit here for energy appreciation, because you need to know how to look at nature. And by nature, I mean, the birds and the bees and the trees around us, and all of the earth and all of the life and the non-life and the role that, and especially when at the end of the course, how that influences humanity and the human situation. And I think we're getting a reminder of the importance of energy with the current political events, the Straits of Hormuz and all of this sort of thing. So who knows where we're going to be with that stuff by the end of this course. Now, I want to, as an objective for all of us, to understand the importance of energy. We think of the economy in terms of the importance of money, of dollars, but we'll see that dollars are only a lien on energy. Take the dollars out, you can still have an economy. Take out the energy, the economy stops. I want to honor those who helped us understand these principles that I'm going to give, and show the role of energy and also natural science. I'm a natural scientist, in understanding contemporary events, attempt to dispel some myths and help prepare us for the future. Unfortunately, in our academic situation, energy is usually given to us as a chapter in a physics course or a physics lab. You might have a couple of labs in energy, but in ecology, I'm an ecologist, a systems ecologist, it is usually considered only in one chapter on what's called trophic, meaning food dynamics. In economics, if it's considered at all, it's only as a commodity. And I would like to explain how this is really missing the universality of what I'm trying to teach in this course, the universality of energy. And so, in fact, energy is part of every single thing we do. Take the kitchen. We may think of energy in the kitchen when we turn on the gas to boil the water or turn on the oven or whatever. But who thinks of a sharp knife as an energy or force concentrating device? Of cooking as a means of giving the human gut access to plants whose cell walls made most plants inaccessible to us before? Or when we do dishes. I just did some dishes this morning. Every time I do the dishes, I'm thinking about energy. So obviously the physical energy you use when you scrub stuff, try to get the food separated from the ceramic bowl. Hot water has more energy than cold water, so you use hot water to do more work, which is removing the crud from our dishes. Um, and my favorite energy when doing dishes is not my wife's, by the way, is the Gibbs free energy. That is, you put in clean water into a dirty dish, and the energy that's in the water molecules will pull the particles of food or burnt stuff or whatever overnight off of the dishes. So I really like to take a dirty dish and not do my energy into getting it clean, but use Gibbs free energy to get it clean. Okay, this class will have 8 lectures of an hour each, and half an hour, I think I said 1 hour in what I sent out, but half an hour of a week more if you want, I don't know. If questions afterwards, they're given at Mondays, 8 successive Mondays at 11 a.m. We got to talk about who I am. This is the first lecture today. Who I am, what energy is, our history of understanding energy, and the laws of thermodynamics. That's the first one. And incidentally, I'm going to try to make this class accessible to all of you, whether or not you've had physics in college or indeed anything in college. I'm going to try to make this explanation straightforward, even though we'll deal with fairly sophisticated concepts. Okay, now, a week from now, we're going to talk about the particular role of the sun and the early Earth environment, the evolution of life, and the importance of green plants, and the adaptations forced on life in an increasingly oxygenated environment. We'll talk about the formation of fossil fuels. Fossil means old, it means coal, gas, and oil. And then the evolution of increasing biotic complexity in the earth. And finally, ecological systems. And we'll talk about how one measures these things. As I taught for many years, students in various universities. The third class, we'll talk about the evolution of mammals, proto-hominids, we're hominids, and the early hominids, and our own species, and the increased exploitation of energy by humans over the human time on Earth. Fourth, we'll talk about the Industrial Revolution in our modern situation. The fifth, we'll talk about my specialty, my minor claim to fame or medium claim to fame, energy return on investment. And then we'll talk about how much energy is left for humanity, and are there limits to growth? The sixth lecture will be how economists view the economy. And the seventh will be how people with the biophysical perspective, which is me and my colleagues, view the economy, a completely different approach to economics. I guess I would like to say under number 6, I think that standard economics is a pile of cards, and we're going to talk about that. And the 8th will be open for discussion, and it will be up to you. So that's what the course will be. And let's go on. Who I am. We're going to start with who I am. I think this might be important. This is me when I was 12 or so. And it was on the front page of the Hingham Journal, my hometown newspaper at the time. I didn't even know this picture was being taken. A guy who sold pictures to the newspapers of local life took this while I was concentrating on my fishing at Triphammer Pond. And this was what I was. I was just a kid. I was always outdoors, always interested in water and specifically fishing, but anything else to do with life in the water always came in muddy and with turtles and frogs and, all that standard stuff that used to be, well, it wasn't standard for kids, but many kids were of that nature. I grew up in this marvelous small New England town, 20 miles south of Boston, Hingham Harbor. And I became early on fascinated with these critters that are called brook trout. And I became obsessed. And for the next 80 years or however many, I guess 70, I'm 82 now, will turn 83 during this class. I was obsessed with first brook trout and then trout fishing in general, which I learned even as I got my PhD was as complicated as the biology I was learning for. Fly fishing was as complicated to learn as was the biology I had to learn for a PhD. I was an Eagle Scout and I had wonderful parents, and my father instilled in me a great respect for truth. And I think I went on to science partly, or maybe majorly, because I found science is a means of approaching the truth. It's not perfect, but it is the biggest virtue is it's self-correcting. And that was consistent with my long Boy Scout career outdoors and with a strong moral purpose that I think is important in instilling in young children. There's another picture of me on the coast of Massachusetts with my dog Timmy. And then I went to Colgate, a liberal arts college in upstate New York, beautiful place. And I I loved it because there were lots of trout in the streams, including that stream that flowed through campus. I caught trout right in campus. Um, so that made me happy. And I was a literature major. I didn't really know what I was doing, although I was happy with what I was learning until one day somebody said to me, "What are you doing tomorrow afternoon?" And I said, "I don't know." And he said, "Well, there's a guy, this is maybe 1960, 63 or so." He said, "What are you doing tomorrow afternoon?" And I said, "I don't know." He said, "There's a guy coming and lecturing on ecology." And I said, "Ecology, what's that?" And he said, "Well, it's about swamps. You'll like it." And I went to this lecture and I was at that. And from that, I was fascinated. It was a fellow who graduated from Colgate, had gone on and got his PhD from Michigan and was a professor at North Carolina State University. And he showed pictures of he and his students out in a salt marsh in North Carolina. And they're out there with all the scientific equipment and with nets and all kinds of stuff, working hard to study the flow of energy in this estuarine, in the salt marsh environment. And, from the coast, I was quite familiar with salt marshes. And so I said, "You mean you can make a living doing this?" And so from that hour until this hour, I've been an ecologist. And I found out it was very difficult because I had to take a lot of chemistry and physics and biology to prepare myself for graduate school, for being accepted in graduate school. And I, at about age 25, I decided that there were three big things I could do with my life. I looked at the future as a long road in front of me. And I thought, what do I want to do on this road? And I thought about it in great detail. And I decided what I wanted to do was become a good ecologist, do a lot of fly fishing, and maybe have a family. I didn't know, but that was sort of out there in front of me. And I certainly like girls. And I decided I could do only two of them well. And I opted for one and two, and by choice, do not have children. And although I got happily married at 45, that's a different story. And here I am. I went to Penn State, where I was perhaps an undistinguished student, and then I met this guy, great big tall fella, 6'4", Howard Odom, and he was the most I've spent my whole life in nuclear labs and in Ivy League and distinguished state universities and so forth. I never met a person with the intelligence and the understanding of this person, and it made such a difference to my life. And I had a terrific time as a graduate student at the University of North Carolina, a very lovely and enchanting place. And I was really, really into what I did. And I would work 60 to 80 hours, not a day, that should be a week. And here I am. Now, initially, I was having trouble coming up with a research topic. I knew I wanted to work in the water and preferably streams, but I didn't really know what on. And so we had these lecture series at University of North Carolina and brought in famous people from all around the world to give these lectures every week. And so one week we brought in a famous salmon biologist from University of British Columbia, Peter Larkin, and he came to University of North Carolina and gave a presentation on the population biology. That's dealing with the number of individuals and how many young they produce and how many survive and so forth of Pacific salmon. And I was enthralled by this lecture. And that evening, the chairman had us all over to his house for beers and potato chips. And Odom took myself and Larkin into a corner and said, no one has studied fish migration from a systems perspective. And in that instant, I knew I had my PhD topic, but I needed a place to do it. And I looked at all around North Carolina looking for the right place, but most of the streams were too big or too polluted. And then I found only about, I think, 8 miles from my laboratory was this beautiful creek, New Hope Creek in Duke Forest. It's sort of reminiscent of the trout streams of my boyhood. And so this is where I did my PhD work. And you'll see how this leads into this course on energy. So I spent 2.5 years. I blocked off the stream with what's called a weir. This is in summer. The stream normally had more water than you see right now. And I blocked it off with a hunk of hardware cloth. And I became really expert with pop rivet guns and hardware cloth and aluminum pieces. And I'd catch the number of fish moving upstream and downstream. And I did this, as I said, for 2.5 years. And I measured 10,000 fish. It's a lot of fish. Now, at that time, the fish were thought to not, there was no focus on fish and streams as moving. The focus was on territoriality and that kind of behavior. But I found, in fact, that the fish were moving very, very strongly. And so this is from the summary of my work, and you see the big pulses of migration in the spring and a small pulse in the fall. And these are numbers and mass. It doesn't matter exactly what we're looking at here, but that's just how I summarize a huge amount of data. And what I would find were the small fish were moving downstream and the big fish were moving up with all the different species that I was dealing with, some 20 odd different species. And so I studied the fish, and I also studied what is called the metabolism or the energy production and use of this stream, New Hope Creek. And I did it at downstream stations, downstream stations on the left and upstream stations on the right. And you go through this very complicated procedure, correcting for diffusion. It's not important to explain here, but the point is, I found that as you went progressively upstream and the stream became shallower, the energy availability would come in per square meter, but it would be used per cubic meter. And so the energy used and available for the fish became more and more concentrated. And I put this all together in my PhD work. Here is a pattern, and the first thing I found was that the stream, the upper line is the total energy used, and the lower line is the total energy produced by photosynthesis. Now you might ask, how can an ecosystem use more energy than it produces? Well, this is from the leaves falling into the stream, which provided food for the bugs, which provided food for the fish. So I did this some 80 times. I did took a lot of what are called Winklers or oxygen analyses. And incidentally, I want to stop here and just say I'm going to use simple XY or Cartesian graphs. This is time, that's months of the year, and this is metabolism, that's the quantity of energy used by the entire stream ecosystem per square meter. And this is the energy used, and this is the energy produced by photosynthesis. Now, if anybody has problems, if they don't understand straightforward XY graphs, you may speak up now, or you may send me an email and I'll give you a little primer on how to present data over time. And that's what most of the heavy duty science of this class will be about. It'll be looking at how the quantity of things over time. Okay, now you see what happens as the sunlight becomes higher and higher in the spring, the photosynthesis and the energy use becomes greater and greater until the forest canopy develops. And as the forest canopy develops, then the trees over the stream intercept the sunlight and you get less. So I just found these simple but marvelous patterns of energy production and use of an ecosystem that has served me well throughout my life. And I found, you might ask, how can an ecosystem use more energy than it produces? And as I said, it's very simple. The forest, in a sense, gives an energy subsidy to the stream ecosystem and adds in more energy than the stream itself produces. So as oil subsidizes modern civilization, leaves subsidize the stream. It's the same thing. And I made these complicated diagrams of the relation between the downstream ecosystems and the upstream ecosystems. You don't have to worry about any details here. But an important thing is I found the fish, which I, as a fisherman, always focused on, was only about 1% of the energy use of the stream. And the important stuff that was going on in the stream energetically with the plants and the microbes, the small things, and perhaps the insects, and the fish, they were there, but they were not the critical issue. To a fisherman, that was quite an important thing to learn. Okay, so the point is I started out doing a lot of field work and trying to understand ecosystems. But the important thing is during this work, I developed the concept of EROI, or energy return on investment. And EROI is very simple math. It's the energy delivered to society or an organism from an activity over the energy put into that activity. So from this perspective, I found that for my fish in New Hope Creek, they would gain at least 5 calories from their migration for every calorie it took for them to swim upstream. And that's where the idea of energy return on investment came from. Okay, that's, my minor claim to fame. As I told my mother, I became a micro celebrity based on that idea. And then I went on after my PhD, and I worked at 2 national labs. These are fundamentally nuclear labs, at Brookhaven National Lab, at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. I also worked at in Woods Hole. You may know about that from the oceanography and marine biology that goes on there. And then mostly I was a professor at Cornell University for 13 years, at the University of Montana at the biology station, and for the remaining, I think, 30 years at SUNY, meaning State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry. So it's a complicated, well, not that complicated, life as a researcher and professor. And I guess if you want to ask, I've written 14 books and 350 papers on energy, and depending who you ask, I might be considered by one of the half dozen global authorities on energy, or maybe not if you have a different perspective from mine, but many people might say that. So I know a lot about energy, and I've rubbed elbows with a lot of famous people in these various institutions. So if you saw the movie Oppenheimer, for example, I knew some of the people that were in that movie. Okay, the major influences on me during graduate school were, of course, my advisor, Howard Odom, a guy named M. King Hubbard, and a guy named Jay Forrester. And it went something like this. From Odom, I learned of the incredible importance of fossil fuel energy. Few environmentalists know how to deal with this issue well. Energy, of course, is a two-edged sword, and we'll talk about both edges. Most environmentalists talk about the negative edge, but there's also a very positive edge as well that we need to talk about. And so I asked, why do we focus in our schools and society so much on the environment and so little on resource availability? So
hours after a drive.
Somebody needs to shut off their microphone.
Still think they'll drive.
Just a minute.
Beautiful.
It looks pretty good,
It
yeah.
looks beautiful. It's similar to the one I have down here, but it's that crummy material that
Who's speaking?
I wasn't aggressive enough in saying I want to replace.
I think it's Ginger Scott.
We'll be back in a couple hours.
Yeah,
Gonna be around.
and I'll be around the rest of the day.
Okay.
When do
Who
you?
the heck is she? Just a minute.
It's not gonna take that long.
It's so awesome. I think it's such a good.
Peter Scott.
You know,
People forget to mute themselves and then they go off and have other conversations.
Yeah,
I could have got the bits
I'm
to
having a hard time.
on the edge, but it would have been.
Let's put
Quite
everything-
interesting though to listen what people talk about.
Well, but that's not what we're trying to do here.
No,
You're
understand.
sharing.
If you, I think if you right click on participants, if you go
Yeah,
on
mute.
participants
Yeah, I
and,
got rid of one person whose thing is open.
oh, here we go. Ginger, we were listening to your talk.
No, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I thought I was muted. I'm so sorry.
Okay, okay. Let's go on now. So, what does energy do? What does it do for us? Well, let's give you an idea of what oil means to us. Now, this is a 33 horsepower. You see them all, they're actually mules, I guess. 33 horsepower combine. And it takes 5 people to run it. And it can do 33 horsepower of work. Now let's compare that. Now this is about 1910 or so. And here's a 200 horsepower combine today, a harvester today doing the same thing. But you see, one person has 200 horsepower at his disposal, his or her disposal. And here we have each person has 6 horsepower at their disposal. So the availability of petroleum has enormously increased the size of our muscles. It's made us much more powerful, and it's made our economy much, much more powerful. And we're going to look at what this means. It means, you know, my father had to go out and milk the cows every morning and had to grow the crops and stuff like that. And that's something that I didn't have to do. Now, from Jay Forrester, who was not my personal professor, but his papers were very important to me. Now, he was the inventor of RAM, meaning computer random access memory, computer memory. And he has this grid of wires with little tiny iron donuts in there, which are either turned on or off. And this is the origin of digital math for a computer. If you energize one wire this way and one wire that way, then that, where they cross through a little iron donut, that will be magnetized. And you can detect whether that is on or off. And when it's on, when it's magnetized, that means 1 in digital math. And if it's not turned on, it means 0. So this is how he invented computer memory. And of course, it's become much more sophisticated now, but it was just amazing. And he also made computer models of the human situation. And so I was only interested in graduate school in trying to understand how nature worked. But from Forrester, I began to say, well, you know, you can approach the human situation as well, thinking in somewhat the same ideas. And we'll, of course, spend a lot more time on that. Now, some of his students, especially Donnell and Dennis Meadows, wrote this book, a very, very famous book, the most famous environmental book ever written. I think it sold 10 million copies around the world, maybe more. The Limits to Growth, and this made a big impact on me. And basically, they made a computer model with just a few major components, which they'd run over time. This is from 1900. So this is the past, and this was done in 1970 to 2100 of resources, just a very generalized concept of resources. The food per capita being very important, industrial output per capita, the pollution, and the human population number. This is births and deaths and the human population here. And it predicted there would be humans' population would grow, continue to grow till and then declined very rapidly, which caused a big stink with the people who didn't like this idea. But anyway, this was called the limits to growth. And if you think about it, every single political candidate is operating on the concept of more. But this was the first big study that said maybe we can't do more, that human aspiration, human enterprise cannot grow indefinitely. And that influenced me a whole lot back in 1970s in thinking about the human situation and, in a sense, the ecology of the human species. And then one fateful day, I was browsing in the University of North Carolina bookstore and found this, Resources in Man, and written by this guy, M. King Hubbard, who I got to know reasonably well at some point. He was a geophysicist, worked for Shell Oil, and in 1956, he wrote a paper with predictions for the peak year of US oil production. And everybody looked at that with horror, and they said, peak oil, are you kidding? We'll just keep producing more and more oil every year. And this was his prediction in yellow from 1900. You see how the growth of oil increased enormously from 1900 to 1970. And he predicted this, it actually peaked. The green is for the lower 48. So his prediction was pretty good, a little bit low. And he said this is for the lower 48. I don't know about Alaska because the time he made his predictions, they didn't know about Alaska. And Alaska produced quite a lot of oil until it began to decline as well. So we'll talk about this in the future. It gets a little more complicated, but a lot of people didn't like this at all. But this influenced me a lot. Hubbard's idea, and this is called the Hubbard curve, going up, reaching a peak, and going down. And you may have heard of the concept of peak oil. Still a very important concept, and we'll talk about it in this class. And so I kept studying fish migrations, and I made computer models of photosynthesis. This data was taken right here. So let's look at this data in the Fraser River plume. The photosynthesis would peak in March, April, about here, about this time of year, actually, a little bit later. And then the zooplankton, which is the food of the salmon, little animals, little shrimp-like crustaceans that the ocean is full of. So there'd be a big pulse of phytoplankton and then a pulse of zooplankton, and the little salmon would come out and bam, hit that little pulse of zooplankton, which would move northward with the year. And then the little salmon would move where these dark arrows show and move up following the pulse northward. And I got interested in making computer models of all this. Very complicated. So I did mostly a lot of ecology, but then, I'll tell you what happened then. I became disinfected with many models in ecology, not my models, mind you, but which I thought were mostly BS. That's a whole nother story. So I spent 7 years studying economics as a young professor, with two really good students helping me a lot, Cutler Cleveland and Robert Kaufman. And I thought in economics, their models would be better. And so we're going to talk about that I found out that basic models in economics are even worse than the ones in most of ecology. So anyway, it seemed to me, remember, I'm seeking the truth. It seemed to me that economics as a discipline violated all the principles and laws of natural science that I had just spent a dozen years of hard work learning. So I started to apply my natural sciences to the economic issues. And the first thing I did was we used yield per effort concepts. This is fisheries concept from fisheries to look at oil drilling and found amazingly, just like for fish, every fisheries class teaches you that the harder you fish, the less you get per effort. And the effort in the fishing is called the boat day. The harder you fish, the less you get per effort. And we found out the same thing was true for oil. The more feet you spent in a year looking for oil, the less you found. Well, that was amazing. Yeah. In other words, some people kind of say drill, 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 but you drill more, you don't necessarily find more oil. In fact, you usually find about the same amount because you haven't worked out the geology of a good place to drill. And this was reported on the Wall Street Journal, the first page of the Wall Street Journal. And we had an amazing amount of attention for a little while. So we worked on that, and then we expanded this work. And this paper in the science is, the place for scientists to publish either Science or Nature. And so we wrote a paper called Energy in the U.S. Economy, a Biophysical Perspective. Biophysical means a biological and physical science, in other words, a natural science perspective. Now, conventional economics is a social science perspective, completely different. So we wrote this, and this paper, I'm very proud of it today, showed how all kinds of basic things like inflation and worker productivity and even the economy itself was simply dependent upon energy, principally oil. As you use more and more oil, you, of course, got more and more economics. And as we see today, you cut off the oil and the economics starts to take a nosedive. And we published this as the cover issue of Science magazine. So this is a lot full of dead cars and a dead oil well, but it's a little ambiguous the way they actually used our picture. But I may be the only person ever to be denied tenure at an Ivy League university on the week I had the cover issue of Science. I had the best publication you could have, and yet I was denied tenure, but that's another story. I was not noted for keeping my mouth shut. And as I said, I thought a lot of my own discipline was bullshit and didn't keep my mouth shut. So, okay, we're going to go on now and start to get into what's leaving me behind. And we're going to talk about the science of energy. We need a few words. We need to define a few words. And incidentally, this will all be recorded and PowerPoints will be available online. We just have to do all of this. So here are the words: empirical. Empirical means you get with your senses. What we would say data. It's supposedly reality, and sometimes we argue about exactly what's empirical, but it's measured data, measured information, or sometimes just observation that we gather with our senses. Normally considered truth or something close to that. Theoretical means it's how we think things might work. So I might say as a theory that the economy is driven by energy. Well, then is that true or not? Well, we have to examine the evidence. And so that's a different issue. But we might have various theories about how things do or don't work. First principle are things that we know are true, that to our knowledge have never been broken. Newton's laws are important. The laws of thermodynamics are perhaps the most important ones. And then validation is the way that you examine whether your theory, let's say you have a model, is or is not represented by empirical data. So I showed you Hubbard's curve for the production of oil, conventional oil in the lower 48 states compared to the actual data. That is showed that his model is pretty well validated. And that's what validated means. We'll use these words from time to time in the lectures that come up. I have a hand. Richard, would you like to say something?
Just a brief comment. I think that validation is very important because that means that other people can replicate what it is you have said you found. And that gives science a certain degree of credibility.
That is correct. Thank you. Okay, so let's start with, this is a course about energy. So what is energy? Well, at a very fundamental level, we don't know. You flip the switch and instantly the light bulb goes on, and we think that the electrons are running from the generator unit somewhere through the light switch and up to your light bulb, but they're not. There's something called fields, magnetic fields, electric fields that travel, and we don't quite understand what that is. Well, but we sort of know. We sort of know. Energy, we know its effects. Energy is defined as the ability to do work, which is the ability to exert a force causing displacement of an object. So here I'm lifting up my coffee cup. That requires energy to do it. Where did this energy come from? Oh, well, it came from the sun shining on, let's see, I had grape nuts this morning. That might be supplying the energy that's moving my muscles. So let's say it's a grape nuts, which is barley, which might have been grown in Minnesota or Montana. And so the energy comes from the sun to the earth in what are known as photons, which we don't perfectly know what they are either, but they're sort of little packets or waves of energy that come from the sun. And chlorophyll in green plants and, say, barley plants captures that energy amazingly, and it turns it into sugars. How does it do it? Well, we know a lot about how it does it, and it's just amazing, but it's the most amazing thing that chlorophyll captures the energy and turns it into chemical bonds in sugars, and then puts the sugars together to make more complicated compounds like grape nuts. Little help from us. And so and then that energy comes in my mouth, goes into my digestive system, which pulls those chemical bonds as sugars. Sugars have chemical bonds like this, and that's a storage of energy. And they move my own cells, move it into my cells and into my mitochondria and into the crystals of our mitochondria, which are little factories that are able to use that energy, change it to ATP, which then changes to ADP and releases that energy. And that, it moves my arm. I mean, isn't that amazing? Well, but it happens every day, every time you just take a sip. Not to mention the energy that's in my coffee beans, but that came from Costa Rica or wherever. So, but energy is the ability to do work. We know what energy does. We can measure how much of different energy carriers. Sugar is an energy carrier. It's not a source. The source is the sun. Electricity is an energy carrier. It's not a source. Oil is both a source to civilization anyway, and a carrier in the gasoline in your tank in your car. Well, energy is divided into two types, potential and kinetic. Potential, I'm holding this cup against gravity. I let go of it, and it goes from potential energy into moving or kinetic energy. Okay, we know the forms of energy: radiation, pressure, sound, heat, mechanical, electrical, chemical, so forth. And we know the sun provides us with a lot of it. Most of it, yes and no, but a lot of it. Now, this is from one of my earlier publications on energy, and you can think of over time free energy, that is energy that's able to do work, and we'll talk a little more about that, such as solar input is running out. It's being changed from useful free energy, like a photon, to low temperature gradient energy, unavailable for work. In other words, low temperature heat, or heat at the temperature of its environment. Now, life, this is chlorophyll, this little sort of water wheel put in here to capture that energy as it flows by, is capturing that energy and running the machinery of life, as I just explained with my coffee cup. And so this is basic energy that runs us and our civilization. The sun is using up its sources of energy, its atomic sources of energy, and eventually will, I guess, don't hold your breath, it'll be many billions of years, it will burn itself out. But in the meantime, life has evolved amazingly to capture this energy coming out of the sun in photons. Now think about our ancestors. What did they know about energy? You might think they were stupid, but they had essentially the same brains as we do. And they knew a lot in a practical sense. They knew about the energy of a bow and arrow. They knew that deer had to eat the grass. They knew they had to eat the deer. They knew they had to cook that meat to make it more digestible for us and more useful for us. And we've been hunter-gatherers for far longer than we've been agriculturalists. So you had to understand the energetics of your local ecosystems, or you couldn't possibly survive. Now, over time, slowly we became civilized. Looking at much going on in the world today, I'm not so sure how civilized we are, but let's say we're civilized. We became civilized. Here's Plato in his ancient school. And mostly we attributed whatever went on in the world around us to the gods. And here's some gods. In Egypt, Ra was the chief god, and Zeus. But look at them all. They're all energy gods. Ra was the sun. Zeus was about lightning. Vulcan was about fires for his super forge. Prometheus brought energy, brought the fire to humans. So people were certainly aware of energy, but they didn't know how to think about it. And I'm going to now tell you, briefly how we learned how to think about it. So there began to be a few men and women of science, and we might start with Aristotle, Theophrastus especially, and a few more. And a major question initially that was resolved by science was, how did the planets move? And did the sun go around the earth, which seemed obvious? You looked at it, goes around every day. Or they asked me in my freshman science course, how can we tell whether the earth goes around the sun or the sun goes around the earth? And the first guy to think about this was a really, really good mathematician from ancient Alexandria, Egypt, who was, I think, a Sicilian originally, and his name was Ptolemy. And Ptolemy thought, and he had various measuring devices here, and relative to the stars, you could watch Venus, for example, go, and it would do what's called a retrogression. And nobody could explain the retrogression of Venus. This is from day to day and month to month, the pattern of Venus in the sky. And if you're patient, you can do that yourself. And here's another picture of Ptolemy. And he came up with the idea that everything X's us, the Earth, everything went around the Earth, and Venus went around in what are called epicycles. In the epicycles, he could demonstrate mathematically, would generate this pattern that we observed. And he was a really good mathematician. And he was able to make tables that could predict the position of Venus far, far into the future, and they were very accurate. It's amazing, but he was wrong, because Venus doesn't go around the Earth, it goes around the sun, as do we. How did we figure that out? This is a fantastic book by Kitty Ferguson. I really like reading this book, and it's about Tycho Brahe, who was a Danish noble guy, and he built these. He was really interested in the skies and how the movement of the planets and so forth. And at that time, when they did not have precise instruments, as is the case, for example, with the pyramids of Mexico, they didn't have brass. Well, he might have had brass, but they built very big instruments to give you the accuracy you needed. And so he studied his whole life. He studied the position of the planets, and just before he died, he gave the Polish astronomer mathematician Nicholas Copernicus his data, and Copernicus used Brahe's data to demonstrate unequivocally that the Earth went around the sun and Venus went around the sun too. And this was just an amazing accomplishment. And I didn't really understand the answer. I finally got the answer in the appendix of Ferguson's book of how Copernicus came to his conclusion. And so Galileo understood that and used his telescope to prove further, but then he was threatened with excommunication by the Pope, and as a frail old man, he was forced to say that to recant because the Bible said, or they thought it said, that the sun went around the Earth, and incidentally, they said the Earth went in perfect. Since God was perfect, all the planets would move in perfect circles, and so forth. So everything was dominated by the terrific power of the church at that time. And we have people renouncing climate change today and so forth because of the people who hold power don't like to hear it. So life goes on. So Kepler came along, another guy came along, came up with the 3 laws of motion. The first is the planets travel in an ellipse, not a circle. And this was terrible because that, God only works with circles. But in fact, he showed that God or whoever worked with ellipses, and he had some other laws of motion that are not interest to us now. Galileo, through his telescope, saw that Jupiter had moons and many other things. So we began to use observation to get empirical information to destroy one theory, the theory being that the Earth goes around the sun, and replace it with another theory, that the Earth, did I say it right? That the sun goes around the Earth was the theory destroyed, and then the theory that was eventually supported was that the Earth goes around the sun. Okay, then along came Isaac Newton, and generally realized as one of the very brightest guys ever, and showed that there were energy principles that could be expressed mathematically. Force equals mass times acceleration, and so forth. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Since Newton 400 years ago, there has not been a fourth law of motion. He also came up with a law of universal gravitation that explains things perfectly, although, as Ian showed, was not quite based on the right theory. So science was progressing, but even so, our knowledge of energy in 1800 was totally confused. We had really no idea. And one of the things was we couldn't relate heat and energy. It was thought heat was a substance, a phlogiston, that flowed from hot objects to cold ones, like water would flow from a high place to a low place. Now, meanwhile, some amazing things were happening with the application of energy, although people didn't quite understand it was energy, but they understood that you could burn coal, turn water into steam, which took up a lot more room. So this guy Newcomen came up with a first steam engine, great big things, and he had valves here. Here's one valve. You let in steam, it pushes the cylinder here up, the piston here up in a cylinder, and then you throw in cold water, which condenses the steam. So it takes up only 1/800th the volume, and the atmosphere will push the piston, as long as it's got a tight seal, back into the cylinder. And at the other end, you can attach this to a pump, and he saved England's coal mines, which were filling with water. So this amazing instrument, great big instruments, suddenly steam engines were becoming more important, and then James Watt came along with a much more efficient steam engine, and then we invented trains and steam-powered looms and all kinds of things. Okay, but now while that was going on, there were people who were trying to figure out what the heck was going on. So the first thing they came across was Benjamin Thompson, or Count Rumford, understood. This is how he was watching how workmen would make cannon. And so cannon had to be very strong. So you forge a metal cannon out of steel or iron, and then you drill the hole in it for the cannonball to fit in, and so eventually make it useful as a cannon. But in so doing, he found that the drill would heat up so much that they had to cool it in water. And you had to keep replacing the water so it didn't overheat. Well, he blunted the drill. Now this was turned by horses walking in a circle. And he blunted the drill and drilled it for weeks and weeks, and found that he never ran out of phlogiston. In other words, it appeared that heat could not be a substance, because the amount that this cannon held was infinite. It had to be something else. And he slowly began to understand that heat was the motion of molecules. And that was important. And then the next big thing was to learn that what is important is not just hot, but a temperature gradients between low temperature, useless heat, and high temperature heat. And the guy who figured this out was a French military engineer named Sadi Carnot. And he figured out it was not heat that was needed, but a gradient heat. And he published his work in just 100 copies that fortunately a scientist found one tattered copy in a left bank Paris bookstall. And there's the foundation of everything we know about energy from this guy. It's the gradient of heat that's important. If you have two levels and a golf ball on level, and you can't add energy to the ball, you can't make it roll. You need a gradient in elevation to get work, to move the ball. Likewise, you need a gradient in heat to cause something to happen. Now, and then a really important thing was with Joule. We now don't use calories anymore. We use the term Joule for units of energy. And he was a brewer, and initially his ideas were downplayed by many upper crust scientists who were gentlemen. And so he came up with this device to show the thermal equivalent of mechanical work. So he's got 1 kilogram here next to a meter stick, and he cranked this thing up and let it equilibrate, and he'd have a temperature of the water. And then he'd let it go, and when the 1 kilogram moved 1 meter, he'd have a thermometer that would tell you how much heat was added to his box of water. And he spent his whole life making this experiment better and better and better. And now we realize that the value he came up with is almost exactly the one we use today. And so finally, Sir William Thomson, Lord Kelvin, came along and he said, hey, this guy Joule, he's really got it. And he went on to Joule's theory, went along counter to the accepted knowledge of the time of some substance. And he was open-minded enough to discuss things with Joule and so forth. And so in time, Thomson and a few others put it all together, and he contributed these ideas to the second law of thermodynamics, which was a major step towards the unification of scientific theories. I'm going to end this lecture by telling you what the laws of thermodynamics developed by Thomson, Clausius, Helmholtz, especially Clausius maybe formalized it. And it's this. The first law of thermodynamics: the quantity of energy is conserved. So that means if you add up the heat produced and the original energy in the gasoline or the firewood or whatever, that you will find all of the energy you originally had there, either as the original form of the heat or as the heat produced. But here is the trick. The quality of energy is not conserved, because the heat that's produced at each transformation is low-grade heat, that is heat at about the same temperature of the environment, and you cannot run a machine on that heat. So think of an oil well in the North Sea. We get that oil out and we can operate all kinds of processes in civilization. But there's a lot more heat in the temperature difference between the top and the bottom of the North Sea. But we can't, the gradient in temperature is not enough to run a machine. Okay, there's also the idea, development of the idea of entropy, that this low-grade heat is called entropy, and I'm going to talk about that later. I think it's an often misused entropy. I look at my step-grandson's closet and I think entropy, but that's a more complicated thing. So for the first time, we understood energy in the day-to-day world around us. And Einstein shook us up a little bit, but it's all consistent now. And Faraday and Maxwell and Steinmetz and others helped us understand the relation between electrical energy and heat energy and magnetism and all the rest of it. So this leads eventually, as this class will lead in the next 7 lectures or 6 lectures, to my final professional goal is to roll this unstable rock of neoclassical economics off the cliff and replace it with something called biophysical economics. And that's the end. And that's meant to be a bit of a joke on the end of the petroleum age, which is coming sooner or later. Okay, now I'm going to turn my sharing off, and I'm going to open this to a discussion by anybody, and I hope somebody has some questions. Let me see if I can figure out how to make this a gallery. And incidentally, these are being recorded and will be the PowerPoints and the presentations will be available. I know that there are several of you in the class who are not here now and so forth. Okay, so does anybody have a question? You can either raise your digital hand or you can raise your actual hand. I hope somebody has a question. I've said my piece. No question. No questions.
I've got one, Charlie.
Christian, is that you speaking?
No, this is Max. How
Yeah,
much
yeah.
energy? How much energy can a human worker put out, like in a
About
day
the
or
same
whatever?
as a 60-watt light bulb.
We're about like a 60-watt light bulb. Okay.
Yeah, and so a very strong human working for 12 hours might make a kilowatt hour, kilo meaning 1,000, watt hour of energy. And
How many hours?
kilowatt hour of energy. Now, just a second, and I'm going to use my little converter, and I'm going to tell you how much a kilowatt hour is in terms of, it's 3.6 megajoules, if you care to have it as megajoules.
What about calories?
But kilocalories is 859.8. So they're just different units for the same thing. All we measure when we measure energy is we measure its ability to heat water. Now, when we're measuring such energy, we're not measuring the quality of the energy. So oil has a different quality than the same number of megajoules of hot water, and that doesn't have the same amount of ability to do work of punch as a kilowatt hour of electricity. So when we measure energy, all we're doing is converting it completely to heat, as Joule's machine did, and as you're measuring the increase in heat. Yes, Mary Ellen.
How would you measure the energy of an idea?
Not directly. It's so energy would have to be defined a little bit more carefully there. But in terms of its impact, so if you had an idea, let's say at one point you have an idea to evolve an axe head. You're a cave person. And you say, hey, I think we can take this stone and put it in this stick and cut down this tree. You could measure its effect on the flow of energy by the increased flow of firewood, which you can dry the firewood and measure the heat content. So
Don't you think that an idea has the formation of an idea in your brain has more energy? I mean, I don't think
well,
it's
the
measured.
energy your brain uses a lot of energy, by the way. It's the
Yes.
most energy consuming part of your body. But we can't say that I never heard of it, that you can measure one idea. Now, there are lots of people, including my advisor, Howard Odom, who thought that information was the most concentrated form of energy. And I was never completely comfortable with that. And so I'm not the one who's best suited to answer your question, because I haven't fought with him. I've kind of ignored it because it never made straightforward sense to me. So, but many believe, Mary Ellen, and I can put you on to people who talk about that if you want. Okay, let's see. Who had their hand up? Somebody had their hand up.
That was me, Joseph.
Joseph, hello, Joseph.
Hey,
Yes.
Charlie, how you doing? Thanks for that. It was good. I had a question. Just, are you familiar with Yadvinder Mali's work on sociometabolism? And if you are, do you like him or his
Well,
work?
my hearing is not perfect. I'm old. So repeat the name, please, again. Whose work?
It's Yadvinder Mali is his name. He's at Oxford.
No, I don't think so.
Okay, cool. I might email you about it anyway. I'll send you some of this stuff because I think you'd be interested in it. And I'm quite an avid follower of his, and it's very aligned.
Okay. Well, I'm always ready to learn from you all.
I'd like to take a crack at the relationship between ideas and energy.
Yeah.
I think they're two different things. The idea is a pattern or information of some sort, which is like DNA or some writing of an idea. It's some kind of organization of how we see things. It's a picture or something, but you can't do anything with it without energy. So you couldn't create it without some energy, and you couldn't use it without some energy. But the pattern itself is not energy, I don't think. It's just a pattern. Does that make sense?
I like that very much. You can't do anything with it. You can't move anything without energy. Even a political idea, it has to be turned into the energy of people doing things.
And your brain needs some energy to get the idea, but the brain would use the energy for other things too, and not necessarily, each different ideas that had different impacts of what we could do with them would maybe not use that much different energy for the idea itself. But then to implement the idea, that's where the energy comes in. No work without energy.
I might want to add to that. Hi, Christian. So I think, like ideas, information, and someone brought up DNA. I think these patterns are instructions how to use energy. So DNA encodes for a body. The body is a tool that uses energy. So in the end, evolution forms patterns, forms information that encodes structures, use energy. So ideas is very, we'll have to define this, but I think there is a connection with patterns, information, and energy usage somewhere.
I like that. Richard.
It seems to me that the brain uses a lot of energy in our bodies, and having a thought is just one piece of that, not necessarily measurable. But when that thought is converted into motion or action, that is measurable in terms of the amount of calories that we burn to do something.
Well, I mean, I have a sort of materialistic view of the world, not entirely, but and you also, I can't say life just needs energy, because obviously it needs different elements, phosphorus and obviously nitrogen, carbon, whatever. It needs all that stuff too. And it needs the information and DNA. And I think one of the amazing things is how evolution works. It appears that our little energy factories in our cells were originally, a billion years ago, were originally little free living flagellants, little one-celled organisms that had figured out how to use energy well, and oxygen is part of the deal. And now every single one of our cells has these mitochondria in us, which are modern representations of these early flagellated organisms. And yeah, I knew the person who figured this out. It's really quite an amazing story. So evolution over time has taken into its use in each organism, and the organisms that descend from each of those, ever more potent organisms to help it use more energy. So, for example, early life, when there was no oxygen in the air, it ran on essentially turning sugar into vinegar, which is only using part of its energy. And then when oxygen appeared in the atmosphere, originally it was a toxin. And the initial organisms, the initial response was for organisms or cells to protect themselves from this horrible caustic substance called oxygen. But then other cells, these mitochondria, learned how to use that oxygen to more completely use the energy in sugar. And here we are. I mean, and most of the world has oxygen around it, 20% of the atmosphere. And so it's both the skin has to protect us from oxygen. Or you think of anything you don't want to go stale, a cookie or something you don't want to go stale. You put it in a plastic bag, and if you think about it, you squeeze the air out and you seal it up, because the oxygen is going to degrade your cookie. And so oxygen was originally a toxic material, but then it became a material, and then it became used millions, hundreds of millions of years later, so we could those organisms that could use oxygen to use a higher proportion of the energy in the food, became dominant, at least where there's oxygen. But where there's not oxygen, and that includes a swamp, so you go through a swamp and you can smell the reduced sulfur in the air, or your gut, and smell that every day probably. That's an area that's protected from oxygen, because you don't want to oxidize your food before you get it into your cells where you can use it usefully. Okay, I saw a hand up by where'd you go? Randall, where are you?
Yeah,
There you are.
I was going to ask a question more related to just the practical matters of the chart that you showed us about the limits to growth, and that was put together in 1970 what are the current thoughts now about the future of fossil fuels and how much there is available and when it would finally be depleted?
Well, we're going to spend the whole lecture on that. You want a quick and dirty answer? I mean,
I can
we're
wait till you're.
probably at the peak of the use of oil and arguably, I'm trying to see.
Have we peaked yet?
For oil, yes. For gas, not quite. For coal, it's not clear because we have peaked a lot in our global use of coal, but a lot of it is simply because we're using gas instead to make our electricity. Look, when I started this game, we produced, I think, 82% of the energy that society used for the world from fossil fuels. Most of that from oil. And now, so that was 80% when I started this game in about 1970 or so. And the percentage of our energy from fossil fuel last year, I think, was 81%. So it hasn't changed. And of course, the total amount we use is a lot more. I'm going to talk about this in great depth, but the United States political, ass has been saved by the invention of fracking. And if we were dependent on conventional oil right now, Russia'd have us totally over a barrel. But 90% of our oil and gas now are produced by a new technology, by fracking. And which I think has bought us about 2 decades, and now we're starting to see the limits to fracking, and other people say, well, just if the price of oil goes up, we'll get much more oil from fracking. So I look at US oil production every week. Every Wednesday, I have the site I go to. I can share it with you if you want. See how much oil was produced in the last week. And again, this camera makes things go backwards. We're starting to go down. Now, will we continue to go down as the price goes up? And where does the hover peak apply? And fractal and nobody else does. I'm going to try to answer all those questions. And the real question to me is, what's the energy return on investment? And that's where we'll focus some of the class, is because the economist says, well, the price goes up and for any scarce commodity, and the economic system will produce more of it. Well, that hasn't been true. And with oil, when the price goes up, you can use more money to produce the next barrel of oil, but anytime you're using more money, you're using more energy. And so your net return declines. And I think that's the real determinant of what's going on in the world, or will be going on in the world.
Just a comment. There was on Science just yesterday, just this week, on the cover was that they discovered huge deposits of hydrogen capable of replacing fossil fuels and whatever. Haven't read it. It's on the cover, so could be interesting in that regard, like another
You get
energy
Science?
source. Yeah, on the Science,
Send
I
it to me,
can.
please. Send me the article if you can.
Yes, I probably can't access the article, but I can send you a link.
Okay, because I can't. I don't get Science anymore because I felt it became People magazine for scientists.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, Mary, do you have, Mary Ellen, do you have something? Turn on your mic, please.
Do I have what?
Oh, I'm sorry, it looked like you had another question.
Oh, no, I'm just getting hungry.
Oh, yeah. Well, this is it's supposed to go until 12:30 and we started 10 minutes late and it's almost 10 minutes more. Does anybody have any questions about I mean, this link should work next week and the next week and the next week, but I'll send you out an announcement on Friday and just before every week, so make it easy for you. And anything else that you want, and I always love to hear from you by email if you have some thoughts during the week or whatever else it is. And does anybody have any suggestions? I mean, did this work okay for you? You happy? Is it a good OLLI course and anything like that? Any criticisms you want to say? Don't worry, my skin is very thick. Michael has given me a thumbs up, so okay. Thank you, Michael. And Sharon, all right, good. So far so good. And the people from Germany and New Zealand and wherever, then all you have to do is give this link next week and I'll add you. And don't feel embarrassed if you don't come, but if you want to, you certainly welcome here. And anybody else have a final comment? Looks like no. Well, now I want you to think about energy when you're doing your dishes.
Thank you. It was great. Great session.
Thank you. Okay. Well, I'm getting some more thumbs up. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you. See you next week.
Thank you.
See you next week.
Hmm.